Part of being professional in sports media is being accountable when you get takes wrong. And so far, Stan Bowman's done a reasonable job as general manager of the Edmonton Oilers. On today's edition of Locked On Oilers, we'll grade just how good a job he's doing.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I just wrapped up my third NHL season as a host on the Locked On Podcast Network, and I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So, on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, we are going to be breaking down Stan Bowman's transactions as general manager of the Edmonton Oilers. And some of them, you're going to Google Stan Bowman moves, and I'm not doing AHL trades. I'm not doing pick swaps. We are doing transactions that are trades, free agent signings, and extensions in the cases of several players. So, to start out, we are going to go in chronological order for the purposes of organization, because it can be tricky to keep track of everything when we're trying to keep tabs on so many different categories of player and so many different categories of transaction. So we are going to start with the very first move as general manager, and that came in the summer of August 2024, and that was actually trading for Vasily Podkolzin of the Vancouver Canucks at the time. And real quick, my rubric for these transactions, for these moves, I have, number one, logic. So does the move make sense? Can I understand it? And is it well thought out? I have value. And these are on a scale of 1 to 5. Value as in, is the player going to live up to or exceed how much they're getting paid? And then the final tab, performance. And some of these will not have a grade for performance, so they're only getting graded on 2 criteria because those moves don't have enough of a sample size to make a finalized conclusion on. But Vasily Podkolzin, out of 5, I give it a 4. Logically, he fit as a player who needed opportunity, who needed a chance to play more, and seized that opportunity. Value-wise, he gets a 5. Podkolzin became one of Chris Knobloch's more trusted forwards, somebody who played pretty extensively in the regular season with Leon Draisaitl, put up career highs. And then performance, he gets a 5 for that as well. Podkolzin, for what he cost the Oilers and effectively a cap situation, a cap maneuver to try and find a cheaper forward to fill out their bottom 6 after losing Dylan Holloway and losing Warren Foegele and Ryan McLeod, they needed more bodies. And Podkolzin lived up to every last bit of that. Now, is there more room for Podkolzin, or does he kind of peak out as a 10 to 15 goal guy? That's one way this contract could become even better. If Podkolzin can find another gear and go from a 10 to 15 goal guy to a 15 to 20 goal guy, then you're really cooking with grease for somebody who was effectively a dart throw last offseason for a group that just needed bodies at a certain point. So after Vasily Podkolzin, we get to Ty Emerson, which, if you'll recall, was the Cody Ceci salary dump. The Edmonton Oilers sent Cody Ceci in a 3rd-round pick to the San Jose Sharks for Ty Emerson. Now, look, I like Emerson as an idea a lot. I was very excited about that transaction at the time. Logic-wise, I gave it a 4. It was a straight salary dump. It gave the Oilers more cap flexibility to work with. They went from Ceci's like $3.5 million to Emerson's almost league minimum. And that salary difference mattered a lot as far as filling out the rest of the lineup. If you'll recall, last summer, the Oilers extend Adam Henrique and Corey Perry and Matthias Janmark and Connor Brown. They signed Jeff Skinner. They signed Victor Arvidsson, and they had to bridge Evan Bouchard one more year to get to this upcoming year where that extension will kick in. So with all of that said, I think Emerson, in terms of logic, gets a 4. He was an upside dart throw, somebody who had 27 career NHL games before this season, and somebody who showed some capacity. And look, I know Chris Knobloch never really trusted him all that much this season, and that's hard to come past, but I don't think there was anything in there that jumped out as a massive red flag as far as being a poor or disqualifying player. For logic, he gets a 4. For value, he gets a 4. For what Emerson was, he did a reasonable job for his cap hit. Performance, I would say a 3. He failed to really ever get Chris Knobloch's trust and really solidify his role as a permanent part of the lineup. I'll be curious to see who between him and Troy Stecher ultimately ends up in the pole position for that third pair right-handed defenseman spot when the fall rolls around. But until then, there's at least something there to be interested in. Now, next up, I have the Leon Draisaitl extension, which gets 5s across the board. He finished second in Hart Trophy voting. I can make a strong argument he probably should have won the Hart Trophy this past season. Led the league in goals, really solidified the Oilers' second line in a way that the Oilers desperately needed, with Noah Vander Kane, with Arvidsson and Jeff Skinner not really working out to the degree they thought they might, with Fogle, McLeod, and Holloway all leaving. Draisaitl taking the steps he did as a player this year were unequivocally essential to the Oilers' success this year, and he was really good in the playoffs. First guy ever with 3 overtime game winners in the same playoffs. Somebody who really showed a wider range of outcomes this year, somebody who really added a defensive element to his game that did a really nice job, and somebody I'm really happy for that, the Oilers got him at term, because as time goes on, Draisaitl at 14 is going to look cheap, which I know sounds very jarring as we sit here right now in the summer of 2025, but 3 or 4 years from now, that's going to seem really quaint and really nice for a player who should age reasonably well, because skating, though a useful part of Draisaitl's game, is not what makes him so dangerous. It's more of an IQ and logic and position based game, which should gradually decline less than, say, somebody who's a bit more reliant on foot speed. Then we have two PTOs and a waiver claim in the calendar year of 2024. So the PTOs, Travis Dermott, 12 regular season games as an Oiler, somebody who the Oilers brought in on a PTO, said, we don't really know what we have on our defensive group. We think there's a potential for you to play, and if you stick, we'll keep you. And Dermott played himself into a roster spot with what he did in the preseason on a PTO. So value-wise, you're a PTO, you get a 5. Logic, it's a 4. I love a good dart throw. If a guy plays well enough in the preseason, when you're not dressing a full lineup, when you're playing your young guys or guys who don't really have a path to a roster spot, and somebody plays well enough that you feel you can offer them an NHL spot, even if it is as a 7th defenseman, that's a really good outcome. Performance-wise, Dermott gets a 2. Very clearly a fringe NHLer at this point in his career. Not an actively bad hockey player in the same way, say, a Joshua Brown is, but somebody who was very limited, who failed to really ever earn Chris Knobloch's trust, and was very much a warm body to hold a roster spot in the meantime as the Oilers tried to figure out what their defense was going to look like. If you'll remember, we came into the season with really no idea of what the second 3 guys in this group were going to look like. Once you got past Bouchard, Ekholm, and Nurse, it really could have been any permutation of Kulak and Emerson and Stecher and Ty Emerson and the aforementioned Travis Dermott and Joshua Brown. So with all of those guys in the mix, the Oilers ran it more or less as an open competition. You play well, you get more opportunities. And a byproduct of that was Brett Kulak playing the most minutes he's ever played on a nightly basis as an NHLer this past year for the Oilers on a team that sorely needed him. Kulak, even though his underlying numbers weren't great playing on his offside with Darnell Nurse, he played enough minutes and more minutes that he was able to help the Oilers take a step. And make no mistake about it, even in Ekholm's absence during the playoffs, Kulak and Evan Bouchard were tremendous. They were outscoring opponents, I want to say 8-1 before the conference final, and Ekholm returned from injury. So that's really a byproduct of this. And I'm not giving Travis Dermott credit for that, but he does, by association, by proxy, get a little bit of credit for Brett Kulak taking a step forward because they needed him to. We are going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we're going to talk about the waiver claim, Kasperi Kapanen, the other PTO, Mike Hoffman. I know some of you might have forgotten that one, and a whole lot more. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. We've all been there, logging on early and waiting forever for concert tickets to go on sale, only to lose your spot for a show you've been dying to see. Live music should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of getting tickets, and that's where Game Time comes in. Game Time makes getting concert tickets faster and easier than ever. Prices drop as it gets closer to showtime, and there's a chance you could save up to 60% off with their killer last-minute deals. If you're tired of endless strolling, trying to find the best bang for your buck, Game Time Zone Deals pick the best seats in your section for you. My personal favorite part of the Game Time ticket experience, the panoramic seat view. So you see the view before you buy, no surprises. And with Game Time, the price you see is the price you pay. There are no fees at checkout. If you're worried about what happens when plans change, the Game Time guarantee has your back with a cancellation protection and more. If you're ready to take the guesswork out of buying concert and show tickets with Game Time, download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers as we are navigating mid-July where things can start to get a bit hairy as far as keeping things interesting. But I like doing these evaluations for general managers on a yearly basis. I like looking at it through the calendar year lens as opposed to the season, because Bowman getting the job in mid to late August put him in a weird spot because a general manager is most active at the trade deadline and at the draft in that week between the draft and free agency. Because Jeff Jackson was the one navigating that window, Bowman was put in a spot where he needed to respond to the offer sheets for Dylan Holloway and Philip Broberg. He needed to shed some salary in getting rid of Cody Ceci. He had real question marks in his lineup as far as the bottom six and the right side of his defense, and they found reasonable solutions on a short-term basis is the way I would describe it. That brings us to Mike Hoffman. There's not a lot to say here. Signed to a PTO in preseason. Didn't really look the part of an NHLer. Hoffman's floated back and forth between the AHL and the NHL over the last couple of seasons. Still a plus shot, but not enough of a skater, not enough of a playmaker. Doesn't kill penalties. Doesn't really have an argument for being on a roster at this point in his career other than if he's trying to fill out on a bad team. You know, if you're a team like the Sharks or the Blackhawks, you could do worse than having Mike Hoffman in your bottom six sneak onto your second power play, score 10 to 15 goals in a really inefficient manner. There's always going to be a path for guys like that to hang around on the periphery as the 13th forward, as an AHL regular, even though, you know, the AHL, there are age rules. You can only have a certain number of guys over a certain age. So someone like Mike Hoffman trying to chase the dream one more time, I have no problem with that. I think the Oilers were well within reason to see if there was anything there. They weren't sure how they were going to line up their forward group. You know, they started with Skinner and Arvidsson with Draisaitl. Skinner went up to play with McDavid. Nuge came down. They tried a lot of different stuff in the early stages of the season. And because of that, they got some answers. And ultimately, I think it helped them make some more informed decisions as far as targets the rest of the year. So continuing on, the next move in sequential order would be claiming Kasperi Kapanen on waivers. And this is a take that I felt aged really well at the time when Kapanen scored the overtime game winner against Vegas. The YouTube short, the TikTok, the Instagram reel I had posted around this time, it started to get engagement again because people were talking about Kapanen and the algorithm gave Kapanen content placement. And what I said at the time was, if Kapanen plays well enough that he stays in the lineup, the Oilers are by recommendation effectively telling other teams, this guy's good enough to stay around in the NHL. And if you'll recall, it had been kind of a bumpy road for Kapanen in recent years. He signed that contract extension with Pittsburgh, didn't really work out there. He got put on waivers, claimed by St. Louis, signed a really cheap deal in St. Louis. St. Louis didn't have the roster spots. He got waived down to the AHL. The Oilers claimed him off of waivers. And if you'll recall at the time, Connor McDavid was hurt. Zach Hyman was hurt. And because of that, the Oilers only had, I want to say, 9 to 10 forwards, including Noah Phillip, up at the time. And they literally needed bodies that could play that night. And by proxy, Kasperi, Kapanen got a chance. And look, Kapanen has a very limited skill set. He's a very fast straight line skater, and he's got an above average shot. You ask him to do anything else, it's really not going to go particularly well. He's not going to facilitate. He can forecheck if his attention is there. You definitely saw that a bit more in the playoffs. There was that feature in The Athletic about how he felt he was playing the best hockey of his career, and he really felt like he found a place. Ultimately, and we'll talk about the re-signing / extension he signed to stay in Oiler after the season ended, but I liked enough of what I saw from Kasperi Kapanen to justify him coming back for another year. Logic-wise, it gets a 4. The Oilers had a gaping hole. They did not have enough guys. Value, he was a waiver claim making like $1 million. That gets a 5. And performance, Kapanen gets like a 4. You know, Chris Knobloch was playing him a lot with Leon Draisaitl in the regular season. And that's a really strong endorsement considering you had Victor Arvidsson and Jeff Skinner in the lineup and you were actively choosing to play a guy you got off of waivers from not a good team, if you'll recall. You know, the Blues took a while to get going. They had to fire Drew Bannister to hire Jim Montgomery. It took them a while to get going. Kapanen played a functional role for the Oilers. Not an every gamer in the playoffs this past year, but somebody I think on a fourth line on a good team is overqualified. I think on a fourth line on a good team, Kapanen can chip in around 10 goals. And if you're getting 10 goals for about $1 million and a half on your fourth line, maybe kills penalties in certain situations if you want to try and get that odd man opportunity because he's such a fast straight line skater. I'd have no problem with giving Kapanen some more of a look on the penalty kill as well. But and real quick, this is becoming a recurring theme the longer we talk about this. It's hard to get burned in the value aisle. You know, you're not expecting a whole lot when you go shopping in the dollar or the discount or the clearance rack. But when you get something nice, you know, I've got a Rangers playoff t-shirt from the 2014 playoffs I bought at the Dick's Sporting Goods clearance rack for like $3. 2 years later, it had survived 2 years on the clearance rack at Dick's Sporting Goods. And it's in the rotation of workout shirts for a reason. You know, it's really low upside. It's really low upside. It's really low risk. You can't really get burned if you're only spending $4 on a t-shirt. And then real quick, the last one of these transactions we'll get to hit in this second segment before we move on. Signing John Klingberg, which logic-wise gets a 3. This was a dart throw of the highest magnitude. We all had no idea what John Klingberg was going to look like coming off of double hip resurfacing surgery after not having played professional hockey in almost a calendar year. With all of that said, and look, if we were basing this just on the regular season, this would get like a 1 across the board. He looked out of his depth. He looked uncomfortable. He went on LTIR. He came back in the playoffs and was great. Him and Jake Walman, who we'll get to in our next segment, formed a really solid sheltered pair that drove play, that won their minutes very handily, especially in terms of expected goals. The analytics loved that Klingberg-Walman pair in the postseason. They were outscoring opponents 5-2 up until the cup final. And he was really good in the playoffs for the Oilers, and they parlayed that into a very classic sign and trade with San Jose. Klingberg is hoping he will get a larger role with the Sharks than he would have had if he went to a good team, and then hopes he plays well enough in San Jose. Maybe he sneaks onto that first power play, gets to quarterback it, have enough points at the deadline to get traded for a second or a third round pick to a team like the Oilers or the Panthers or the Leafs or whatever team you're thinking of that's a Stanley Cup contender that could use an extra puck mover. Value-wise, this gets a 5. They turned a dart throw into a top 6 defenseman who had elite underlying numbers. And look, I know Klingberg looked overmatched in the Stanley Cup final against Florida. He was a bit out of his depth. The game looked a little fast for him. But Florida's really good. I can accept that if John Klingberg were a free agent for the price the Oilers got him at back in January, they would have done it again. But being that he got a nice pay raise to go play with San Jose, and he'll get more of an opportunity to play more minutes, I don't begrudge the guy for looking for a better opportunity. We are going to take our second and final break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we'll talk the deadline moves, the one I like, the one I don't, and we'll talk about the European free agents, the Ike Howard trade, and so much more. Be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Do you ever wish managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning for a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO to give you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is so much more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So, in addition to managing your money, you're building real wealth. Something that I was definitely guilty of and not the best with was budgeting a little bit smarter. And since signing up for Monarch, I have done some little things, a little bit less takeout, a little bit more meal prep, setting aside a set amount of every paycheck, saving up for a big purchase, bought a new pair of noise canceling headphones last week, paid off for a vacation next month that I cannot wait. So if you're ready to take control of your finances, you need to head on over to monarchmoney.com today. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com and you'll get 50% off your first year subscription. One more time, because it's that good a deal. monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNHL, half off your first year subscription. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. Programming note, our goal for most of the summer is to keep with a 4 or 5 podcast episode per week schedule. There will be additional content at some point. I've been toying around the idea with maybe an NHL franchise on the EA Sports video game where we could run through a simulation of this upcoming season, maybe manage the deadline, maybe try and iron out what the McDavid contract's going to look like, maybe target a big fish in the trade market, maybe, go after Jack Eichel or Kirill Kaprizov next summer and really hollow out the Oilers' bottom line. But I think that'll probably come in a few weeks. I got to get the details ironed out. I got to make sure all the bells and whistles are squared away with the network. But there will be a little bit of extra content on the YouTube feeds if that's something that people would be interested in. Continuing on and going through these in chronological order. Next up, we have Jake Walman, and I love it. Jake Walman is such a fun hockey player to watch. Does he take too many stupid penalties? Yes. Do I have some regrettable tweets about him taking stupid penalties, especially in that King series? Yes. But Jake Walman, him and Klingberg were a rock solid third pair that were elite at moving the puck. Were they great defensively? No. But Jake Walman is a real ice tilter. He is somebody who can be a formidable part of a transition offense. I would love to see the Oilers in more dire situations going forward, using him with Evan Bouchard as their we need a goal pair, because I think Walman can offer a little bit more than Ekholm can in those situations. Yes, you run the risk of doubling up on offense and maybe hurting yourself defensively a little bit in those situations, but I think Walman's puck skills are really special. You think about the one goal he scored in the Cup final that was just an absolute missile walking it down. I love what I saw from Jake Walman. The other part that gets a lot of credit for me, the fact he was under contract for the follow-up season, so it was one less thing for Stan Bowman to figure out this upcoming offseason. And look, they're going to ask a lot of Jake Walman this upcoming season. I would not be surprised if they ask him to play in a bit more of a second pair role, play maybe a little bit more of tougher matchups, but all things considered, a conditional set first round pick that's either 26 or 27, depending on where it finishes in the lottery. It's really hard to be mad with the production they got, especially considering he had another year on the deal. Good for the Sharks for getting Jake Walman for a pick from Detroit, where Detroit gave the Sharks a pick, and then getting another pick from the Oilers in return for Jake Walman's services. So great job there. Next up, after that, we get 2-1. I don't like. This is probably the only transaction in the last 8 to 10 months where Bowman's been the GM that I actively dislike. I do not like acquiring players who are injured. Period. No ifs, ands, maybes. I don't like acquiring players who are injured. Trent Frederic played one regular season game as an Oiler before jumping into the lineup in the playoffs, and maybe 70%, maybe 65%. And as the playoffs got along, maybe he got his feet under him a little bit more. I did not really see the fit. And look, I'll be fair. There's a lot of runway in front of him to play a bigger role. Maybe Stan Bowman sees him in the mold of a top 6 forward. Maybe Stan Bowman sees him as the long-term third line center replacement once Adam Henrique is done, or once Ryan Nugent-Hopkins is done as an Oiler, and you need a new third line center. Frederic does have center experience from his time in Boston. I just don't like acquiring injured guys, and I don't think Frederic has nearly the upside a lot of hockey people do. I get it. He's big. He skates reasonably well when he's not hurt. He fights. He forechecks. His career average in goals for a season is 13. Not the biggest fan of acquiring a guy with miles on the treads who has injury questions. And look, again, he's under contract for 8 years. There is plenty of time for him to prove me wrong. I hope he proves me wrong. I hope there's a world where he can play his way into a top 6 role where he's on the left of Draisaitl or on the left of McDavid, and they get a lot more out of him. By association, Max Jones is in this trade as well. Somebody who is really just filling out a lineup spot in the bottom half of the lineup during the period between the trade deadline and the start of the playoffs. Once the Oilers got cap compliant and the cap went away in the postseason, there wasn't really a path to Jones playing beyond a series of injuries. They had a rotation of guys in those final few spots between Kapanen and Jeff Skinner and Arvidsson. So I think they got okay play out of Max Jones in the limited regular season work they did. But that's the Trent Frederic trade. And after that, we get to extensions and we get to free agent. So real quick, I have Jake Walman 5 for logic, 4 for value, 4 for performance. Trent Frederic, I have a 2 for logic, 2 for value, and 2 per performance based on what he did in the playoffs. If he's better, I'm more than happy to amend that to a higher grade. Now, getting to free agency and getting to contract extensions. Evan Bouchard, 5 for logic, 5 for value. I've been very adamant that contract is going to look amazing 2 years from now when Quinn Hughes signs for like $18-19 million per year on his next deal. Cale Makar ditto. I think adding Andrew Mangiapane at the price point they did, I give that a 4 for value and a 4 for logic. He's got upside. He's got a skill set that we saw Vasily Podkolzin play really well, complementing Draisaitl. So I could see a world where Mangiapane plays a similar role. Maybe even it's with McDavid and he can put up closer to 20 goals as opposed to 10. Curtis Lazar, he gets a 3 and a 3. I think Lazar at league minimum is fine as a fourth line wing, as say your Kapanen replacement. Then David Tomasek as your European free agent led the Swedish League in points last year. I love an upside dart throw. Stan Bowman's got a long track record of signing European free agents. The big one, of course, being Artemi Panarin back in Chicago. So if he works out, great. If not, no harm, no foul. After that, you get to the Ike Howard trade, which we talked about pretty extensively last week and why I was so optimistic, why I was so excited about it. Logic-wise, it gets a 5. You needed a scoring winger in here, like right now. Liam O'Reilly is years away, probably 2 from being ready to play at the NHL level. So that tells you the Oilers understand the gravity of the situation, and they need to be going for it right now. In addition, small ones. You had a Kapanen extension in there. They walked away from Corey Perry. They walked away from Connor Brown. I get it. The Oilers had to save money in certain places because of the Evan Bouchard extension and because Draisaitl's contract extension kicks in. I think you're going to learn a lot about how good Stan Bowman is as a general manager in the next 12 months because he has a decision to make on a McDavid extension. He has a decision to make on a Stuart Skinner extension, on a Matthias Ekholm extension, and on a Jake Walman extension. So with those 4 decisions to chew on, there's not a lot of room here for error as the Oilers look to maintain a Stanley Cup contender window into the second half of the 2020s. That will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Thank you so much to everyone who made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Be sure to check out Locked On NHL and Locked On NHL Game Night on the Locked On NHL feeds wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to Locked On Oilers wherever you get your podcasts. Leave the show a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or over on Spotify. If you're watching over on YouTube, subscribe, like the video, leave me comments. How do you feel about Stan Bowman's tenure as general manager so far? I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.